Have you ever been in a room where everyone laughed at you, where every joke landed at your expense, where you could feel the weight of their mockery pressing down on your shoulders like a physical thing, and yet you smiled anyway because you knew something they didn't? I have. I remember that day with crystalline clarity, the kind of memory that burns itself into your consciousness with such intensity that you can recall every detail, every sensation, every emotion that coursed through your veins in those moments. The conference room was cold, unnecessarily so, and I remember thinking how fitting it was that the temperature matched the atmosphere. They sat around that polished mahogany table, these people who thought they knew everything, who believed they had the world figured out, who were absolutely certain that I was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience in their perfectly orchestrated careers. Sarah was there, with her designer suit and her practiced laugh, the one she reserved for moments when she wanted everyone to know she was in on the joke. Marcus sat to her left, arms crossed, that smirk playing at the corners of his mouth like he'd just won some invisible competition. And then there was David, the ringleader, the one who started it all, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from never having been truly challenged in his entire privileged life. They were talking about me as if I wasn't even there, as if I was some kind of abstract concept rather than a human being sitting 3 feet away from them. "Can you imagine?" Sarah said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension that people mistake for sophistication. "She actually thinks she has a say in how we run things around here." The laughter that followed was sharp, cutting, the kind that's designed to wound. I felt it, of course I did. I'm not made of stone. Every laugh was like a small knife finding its way between my ribs, each chuckle a reminder that they saw me as less than, as inferior, as someone to be pitied or mocked, but never respected. But here's what they didn't know. What they couldn't possibly have known, because they were so wrapped up in their own self-importance that they'd never bothered to look closer, to ask questions, to wonder why someone like me would stick around in an environment so hostile, so unwelcoming, so deliberately cruel. I smiled. Not the bitter smile of someone defeated, not the tight-lipped grimace of someone holding back tears, but a genuine smile, warm and knowing, the kind of smile that comes from a place of absolute certainty. And in that smile was a secret, a truth so powerful that it would eventually unravel everything they thought they knew about power, about control, about who really held the strings in this elaborate puppet show they called a career. I thought about speaking up, about defending myself, about pointing out the countless ways they were wrong about me, but something held me back. Patience, perhaps. Strategy, definitely. Because I'd learned something crucial over the years, something that had taken me far too long to understand, but that I now held on to like a precious gem. I'd learned that the most powerful moves are the ones nobody sees coming, the quiet accumulations of influence that happen beneath the surface while everyone else is busy performing their importance on the stage above. You see, what they didn't realize, what they couldn't fathom in their wildest imaginations, was that while they were busy making me the butt of their jokes, while they were investing their energy in maintaining their facade of superiority, I was building something entirely different. Something far more substantial and lasting than their fragile egos could ever construct. I was building power, real power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that doesn't require validation or recognition because it exists independent of opinion or perception. It started small, as these things often do. Little connections here and there, conversations in hallways that seemed inconsequential at the time, favors done without expectation of immediate return, seeds planted in fertile ground that would take years to grow, but would eventually bear fruit beyond anyone's wildest expectations. I remember my first day at Morrison & Associates, walking through those glass doors with my cheap portfolio and my borrowed confidence, trying to convince myself that I belonged in this world of power suits and corner offices. I was 24 years old, fresh out of graduate school, carrying more student debt than I cared to calculate, and nursing dreams that seemed impossibly large for someone with my background, my lack of connections, my complete absence of the kind of pedigree that opened doors in this industry. They put me in the smallest office, the one without windows, the one that had previously been used for storage, and I accepted it with gratitude because at least it was a foot in the door, at least it was a beginning. My title was junior associate, which was a fancy way of saying I did all the work nobody else wanted to do while receiving none of the credit, and barely enough salary to cover my rent in a studio apartment that was more closet than living space. But I didn't complain, didn't protest, didn't demand the recognition I probably deserved even then, because I understood something fundamental about how power actually works in these environments. It's not given, it's not awarded, It's not something you can demand or protest your way into having. It's taken, slowly, methodically, through a series of calculated moves that most people are too impatient or too proud to make. I watched them, these senior associates and partners, these people who seemed to glide through life on rails of privilege and connection, and I studied them the way a scientist studies specimens under a microscope. I learned their patterns, their preferences, their weaknesses disguised as strengths, their insecurities hidden beneath layers of expensive cologne and practiced confidence. Marcus, for instance, for all his bravado and bluster, was terrified of public speaking, which was ironic given that public speaking was supposed to be central to his role. He'd get physically ill before major presentations, and I discovered this quite by accident when I walked past the bathroom and heard him retching before a client meeting. I filed that information away, not out of cruelty, but because information is currency in this world, and I was determined to build wealth. Sarah projected an image of having everything together, the perfect career, the perfect relationship, the perfect life. But I noticed how her hands would shake when she thought no one was looking, how she'd retreat to her office and close the door during particularly stressful periods, how she relied on a cocktail of anxiety medications that she kept in her desk drawer, thinking nobody knew. I knew. I always knew. David was perhaps the most interesting case study of all. He came from money, real money, the kind that buys not just things but access, opportunities, futures. He'd never had to struggle for anything in his life, and it showed in the way he moved through the world, with that unconscious entitlement that comes from never having been told no, never having faced a door that wouldn't open for him. But his privilege was also his weakness because he'd never developed the hunger, the drive, the scrappiness that comes from having to fight for every inch of ground you gain. He was lazy, fundamentally, in the way that people who've never had to work hard often are, coasting on his name and his connections and his family's reputation while doing the bare minimum to maintain appearances. I, on the other hand, had nothing to coast on. No safety net, no family connections, no inherited wealth or privilege. What I had was hunger, ambition, and a willingness to do whatever it took to build something that was mine, something that couldn't be taken away or diminished or mocked into insignificance. So I worked, God how I worked, not just the work they assigned me, but the invisible work. The work that nobody sees or credits, but that builds foundations stone by stone. I stayed late not because I was a martyr, but because those quiet hours after everyone else had gone home were when I had access to files, to information, to the digital architecture of the company's operations. I learned our systems inside and out, became the person who understood how everything connected, where every piece of data lived, which clients were most valuable, which accounts were on shaky ground, which partnerships were about to dissolve. I made myself indispensable in ways that weren't immediately obvious, positioning myself as the person who could solve problems, answer questions, find solutions when everyone else was stumped. And slowly, incrementally, people began to rely on me, to need me, to find that their own success was somehow mysteriously tied to my continued presence and cooperation. The senior partners noticed, of course they did, because they didn't get to where they were by being stupid, only by being willing to overlook certain truths when those truths were inconvenient to their worldview. They saw that I was valuable, that I made their lives easier, that I had a knack for managing the complex interpersonal dynamics that could make or break deals worth millions of dollars. But they also saw that I was young, female, from the wrong background, without the right last name or the right schools on my resume, and so they did what people in power often do when faced with competence that doesn't fit their expectations. They minimized it, explained it away, attributed my success to luck or timing or anything other than skill and strategic thinking. This is where the mockery began. Subtle at first, little jokes about my wardrobe, my accent, my educational background, comments that were always delivered with a smile, always framed as friendly teasing, always calibrated to maintain plausible deniability if anyone dared to call them out for what they really were. Weapons designed to keep me in my place, to remind me that no matter how good I got at my job, I would never really be one of them. Have you ever experienced that particular kind of workplace cruelty? The kind that hides behind jokes and casual comments but cuts deep nonetheless? Comment below and let me know, because I think this is more common than we like to admit. This phenomenon of people using humor as a blade to wound those they perceive as threats or inferiors. At first, I let it hurt me. I'd go home to my tiny apartment and cry angry tears into my pillow, feeling the injustice of it all, the unfairness of working twice as hard for half the recognition, of being brilliant and dedicated and still being treated like a joke. But then something shifted. some fundamental reorientation of my perspective that changed everything. I realized that their mockery, their need to diminish me, was actually evidence of something important. It meant I was getting too big to ignore, too competent to dismiss, too successful to pretend I didn't exist. Their jokes weren't signs of my weakness, they were signs of my growing power, and their fear of that power manifesting as cruelty because cruelty was the only tool they had left to try to cut me back down to size. So I made a decision, a conscious, deliberate choice that would shape everything that followed. I decided to let them underestimate me, to encourage their mockery, to play into their expectations of who I was and what I was capable of, all while building something beneath the surface that they couldn't see, couldn't anticipate, couldn't defend against because they didn't even know it was happening. I became a ghost in my own career, visible enough to be mocked, present enough to be useful, but invisible in all the ways that mattered, the ways that were actually building toward something transformative. And this is where my real story begins, not with the humiliation in that conference room, but with all the years of quiet accumulation that preceded it, all the moves that nobody saw, all the connections that nobody knew about, all the power that I gathered like a miser hoarding gold, waiting for the right moment to reveal what I'd been building all along. The years that followed my decision to embrace their underestimation were strange, surreal in a way, like living a double life where the person everyone saw and the person I actually was existed in completely separate realities. On the surface, I remained the joke, the target, the one they could safely mock without fear of consequences. I played the part well, perhaps too well, laughing along with their jokes about me, never pushing back, never defending myself in ways that would make them take notice and recalibrate their assessment of who I was. I wore slightly outdated clothes, not because I couldn't afford better, but because it reinforced their narrative about me, kept me firmly in the box they'd built labeled, not a threat, not important, not someone to worry about. I let them take credit for my ideas in meetings, watched as Sarah would present something I'd developed and receive praise for innovation and strategic thinking, smiled as Marcus collected bonuses for deals I'd essentially structured and negotiated while he took clients to golf courses and steakhouses. David would grandstand in front of the board, spinning narratives about market positioning and client relations that were built entirely on frameworks I'd created. And I'd sit in the back of the room, taking notes, looking like nothing more than a diligent assistant rather than the architect of the very strategies he was presenting as his own. But beneath this carefully constructed facade of mediocrity and compliance, I was building something extraordinary, a network of relationships and dependencies so complex and far-reaching that even I sometimes lost track of all the threads I was weaving together. It started with the assistants, the people everyone else overlooked, the administrative staff who kept the entire operation running, but who were treated as invisible by the partners and senior associates who were too important to learn their names or acknowledge their contributions. I learned every assistant's name, asked about their lives, their families, their dreams and frustrations. I brought coffee when they looked tired, covered for them when they needed to leave early for family emergencies, listened when they needed to vent about their bosses or their workload or their romantic problems. These weren't manipulative gestures. I genuinely liked these people, genuinely valued them as human beings rather than cogs in a corporate machine, but I also understood that genuine connection and strategic positioning aren't mutually exclusive. Maria, who worked for David, became a particular ally, though she didn't know that's what she was. She thought I was just nice, just someone who treated her with basic human decency in an environment where that was shockingly rare. She'd tell me things, casual observations about David's schedule, his mood swings, his client relationships, information that seemed trivial to her, but that gave me insights into patterns and vulnerabilities that I cataloged and analyzed. Through Maria, I knew when David was stressed, when deals were falling apart, when clients were unhappy, and I could position myself to subtly solve these problems in ways that made me indispensable without ever making it obvious that I was the one solving them. The IT department was another goldmine of overlooked human resources. Everyone treated the tech guys like appliances, things you turned to when something broke and ignored the rest of the time. I made friends with James, the senior systems administrator, by actually listening when he talked about server architectures and data security protocols, by bringing him lunch when he was working through a crisis, by recommending books I thought he'd enjoy based on conversations we'd had about science fiction and technology. James gave me access, not officially, never in a way that would create a paper trail, but access nonetheless. I could see things, know things, understand the digital skeleton of the company's operations in ways that gave me power nobody realized I possessed. I knew which clients were being courted before deals were announced, which accounts were at risk before the account managers knew there was a problem, which internal communications revealed tensions and conflicts that could be exploited or resolved depending on what served my purposes. I started making suggestions, small ones at first, casual observations dropped in conversations with the right people at the right times. I was thinking about the Henderson account, I'd say to Sarah, and I wonder if they might respond better to an approach that emphasizes sustainability rather than just cost savings, given what I read about their new CEO's background in environmental policy. She'd look at me with mild surprise, take the suggestion, implement it, and when it worked brilliantly, she'd take full credit while I smiled and congratulated her on her innovative thinking. But what Sarah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I was building something with each of these small victories. I was demonstrating my value while maintaining my invisibility, creating a situation where their success was increasingly dependent on my insights and input, while they remained convinced that they were the brilliant ones, and I was just lucky or occasionally useful. The senior partners started noticing patterns. They couldn't help but notice that projects I touched somehow went more smoothly, that clients I interacted with became more satisfied and loyal, that problems seemed to solve themselves when I was involved. Richard Morrison, one of the founding partners, called me into his office one afternoon about 3 years into my tenure at the firm. He was old school, a man in his 60s who'd built the company from nothing and who had survived long enough in this business to develop instincts about people that went beyond the superficial markers everyone else relied on. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his massive desk, and I sat, keeping my expression open and friendly, projecting none of the anxiety I felt because being summoned to the founding partner's office was never a casual thing. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said something that both thrilled and terrified me. "You're different from what you pretend to be, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question, more an observation, and I felt my carefully constructed mask threaten to slip. But I held it together, smiled that same self-deprecating smile I'd perfected over years of being underestimated, and said, "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Morrison. I'm just trying to do good work and learn from everyone here." He laughed, a dry sound that held more knowledge than humor. "That's exactly what I mean. Most people your age, with your obvious intelligence, would be pushing for recognition, demanding promotions, making noise. But you're quiet, you're patient. You're building something I can't quite see yet, but that I know is there. I've been doing this long enough to recognize ambition when I see it, even when it's wearing a disguise." My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "I just want to be valuable to the firm, sir. I want to contribute in whatever way I can." "Valuable," he repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, that's exactly what you're becoming. Too valuable, perhaps, for the position you're currently in. I'm watching you and I like what I see. Don't let the others make you small. They're frightened of you, whether they know it or not, and frightened people do cruel things. But you're patient, and patience in this business is worth more than brilliance." He dismissed me after that, but something fundamental had shifted. Richard Morrison saw me, really saw me, and while he didn't offer me a promotion or public recognition, he gave me something more valuable. He gave me permission, tacit but real, to continue building whatever I was building, and he positioned himself as someone who would be watching, protecting perhaps, creating space for me to grow in ways that others might try to prevent. After that meeting, I doubled down on my strategy, becoming even more deliberate about building connections not just within the firm, but throughout the industry. I attended every conference, every networking event, every professional development workshop, not to collect business cards or make shallow connections, but to genuinely learn, to understand the landscape of our industry, to identify the key players and influencers who shaped decisions and directed resources. I met Catherine Zhou at a conference in Singapore. She was a venture capitalist with a portfolio that included some of the most innovative companies in our sector, and we bonded over a shared frustration with how women were treated in male-dominated industries. We stayed in touch, casual emails at first, then regular calls, then a genuine friendship that transcended professional networking. Catherine became one of my most valuable allies, though she didn't know it in those terms. She thought we were just friends, which we were, but friendship and strategy aren't mutually exclusive. Through Catherine, I gained insights into investment trends, got advance notice of which companies were being funded, which sectors were about to explode, which technologies would disrupt our traditional business models. I fed this information back into Morrison & Associates in subtle ways, positioning the firm to be ahead of curves that our competitors didn't even know existed yet. Our client acquisition rate went up, our retention improved, our reputation for innovative thinking grew, and I remained in the shadows, the junior associate who somehow kept being in the right place at the right time with the right information. I did the same thing with Marcus's biggest client, Jonathan Reeves, the CEO of a manufacturing company that represented about 15% of our annual revenue. Marcus treated Jonathan like a golf buddy, all surface-level charm and expensive dinners, never bothering to dig deeper into what Jonathan actually needed from our partnership. I studied Jonathan's company obsessively, read every quarterly report, analyzed every market trend that affected his industry, understood his pain points and pressure points better than his own board probably did. Then I arranged, very carefully, to run into Jonathan at an industry event, made it seem completely accidental, struck up a conversation that quickly moved from pleasantries to substantive discussion about the challenges facing his sector. Jonathan was surprised. I could see it in his eyes. Surprised that someone at Morrison & Associates actually understood his business, beyond the surface-level consultant speak that Marcus typically deployed. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of that conversation, Jonathan asked for my card, asked if he could reach out when he had questions or needed insights. I gave him my information, mentioned casually that I was always happy to help however I could, and then I went back to the office and said nothing to anyone about the conversation. Over the following months, Jonathan started calling me, emailing me, asking for my opinion on strategic decisions. I always helped, always provided value, never asked for anything in return, never mentioned these interactions to Marcus or anyone else at the firm. I was building loyalty, creating a dependency, ensuring that Jonathan's relationship with Morrison & Associates was increasingly tied to me rather than to Marcus, who was too busy taking credit for my work to notice that he was being slowly, methodically replaced as the actual point of contact. Have you ever built something so quietly that nobody noticed until it was too late to stop you? Share your experience in the comments because I think there's something powerful about the strategy of invisible accumulation, about building power without announcing it. The mockery during this period became almost comical in its intensity and my indifference to it. Sarah started calling me our little helper in meetings, a diminutive that was designed to infantilize and dismiss me. Marcus would make jokes about my fashion choices, suggesting that maybe the firm should start a fund to help me update my wardrobe. David, ever the ringleader, started a running gag about how I was basically the company's mascot. Present but not really important, decorative but not functional. They'd laugh, and I'd laugh with them, and inside I'd feel this strange mixture of amusement and contempt because they were so convinced of their own superiority that they couldn't see what was happening right in front of them. They couldn't see that every assistant in the building would do anything for me, that IT gave me access they'd never give the partners, that I had relationships with clients they thought were exclusively theirs, that senior partners like Richard Morrison were watching my career with interest and approval. They couldn't see that I was building an empire within their empire, constructing a power structure that ran parallel to the official hierarchy. But that was in many ways more real, more substantial, more durable than the formal org chart that had their names at the top and mine near the bottom. The turning point, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. The kind of moment that feels surprising in the instant, but that you realize in retrospect was always going to happen, was always the natural conclusion of years of careful planning and strategic positioning. It started with a crisis, as these things often do. Morrison & Associates had been pursuing a massive contract with Meridian Technologies, a company that was about to go public and needed comprehensive consulting services for the transition. This wasn't just any contract. This was the kind of deal that could define a firm's reputation, that could open doors to dozens of similar high-value engagements, that represented not just immediate revenue but long-term positioning in an evolving market. The partners had been courting Meridian for 8 months, throwing everything they had at the pitch, deploying David's family connections, Marcus's supposed expertise in tech sector transitions, Sarah's carefully cultivated reputation for innovation. They were confident, perhaps overly so, convinced that the contract was essentially theirs to lose. I knew better. I'd been watching Meridian from a distance, reading everything I could about their business model, their leadership team, their stated values and unstated priorities. What I saw was a company that was tired of the old-school consulting approach, tired of firms that talked a good game but delivered cookie-cutter solutions wrapped in expensive packaging. Meridian wanted something different, something more authentic, more substantive, more genuinely innovative than the standard playbook that firms like ours typically deployed. I tried to tell them, tried to suggest that our approach needed to be fundamentally different if we wanted to win this contract. I wrote a memo outlining an alternative strategy, one that emphasized genuine partnership over transactional consulting, that proposed embedding ourselves in their operations rather than delivering recommendations from a distance, that suggested we align our compensation with their success rather than charging hourly rates that incentivize drawn-out engagements. I sent this memo to Sarah, to Marcus, to David, laying out my reasoning, backing up my suggestions with research and analysis. Sarah read it and laughed, literally laughed, before forwarding it to the others with a note that said, "Our little helper has big ideas. Adorable. But let's stick with what works." Marcus responded with a dismissive email about how I didn't understand high-level strategy, how my suggestions would undermine our profit margins, how I should focus on my actual job, rather than trying to play consultant to the consultants. David didn't even bother responding, just deleted my memo and continued preparing the pitch exactly as they'd originally planned. I felt the anger then, hot and sharp, the frustration of being right and being ignored, of seeing a disaster coming and being powerless to prevent it. But I channeled that anger into something productive, into action rather than reaction. I reached out to Catherine Zhou, my friend the venture capitalist, and asked if she knew anyone at Meridian. As it turned out, she knew their CEO, Amanda Chen, quite well. They'd worked together years ago and had maintained a friendship. I asked Catherine if she'd be willing to make an introduction, frame it as casual, just connecting two people she thought might find value in knowing each other. Catherine agreed, understanding without me having to spell it out that this was important, that I was calling in a favor. She made the introduction via email, and within a day, Amanda Chen and I were scheduled for coffee. We met at a small place near Meridian's offices. Nothing fancy, just two professionals having a conversation. Amanda was brilliant, intense, focused in a way that reminded me of myself, someone who'd built something from nothing and who wasn't interested in bullshit or performance, just in real solutions to real problems. We talked for 3 hours, and I didn't pitch Morrison and Associates, didn't try to sell her on anything. Instead, I listened, asked questions, tried to understand what she actually needed, what kept her up at night, what success looked like from her perspective rather than from ours. And then, when I understood when I really got it, I shared some thoughts, not as a formal proposal, but as one professional talking to another about challenges and potential solutions. I told her about the alternative approach I'd suggested to my colleagues, the one they'd dismissed, and I explained why I thought it might work for a company like hers. I was honest about the fact that I was junior at my firm, that I didn't have the authority to make promises or commitments, but that I believed there was a way we could work together that would be genuinely transformative rather than just another consulting engagement. Amanda listened, really listened, and when I was done talking, she said something that changed everything. "I like you. I like how you think. I like that you're not trying to sell me something, but actually trying to solve problems. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell your firm that we'll only sign with them if you're the lead on our account. Not David, not Marcus, not any of the partners, you. If they can't agree to that, we'll go with another firm." I felt the world tilt, felt the ground shift beneath my feet, felt the weight of what she was offering and what it meant. "Amanda, I appreciate that, but I need to be honest with you. I don't have the political capital at my firm to make that happen. They'll never agree to put a junior associate in charge of your account. It goes against everything about how they operate." She smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd been underestimated herself, who understood exactly what I was dealing with. "Then let me handle the politics. You just be ready to do the work when they say yes, and they will say yes, because they're not stupid enough to turn down a contract this size over their own egos, are they?" I wanted to tell her that yes, they might be exactly that stupid, that egos in this business often trump rational business decisions, but I kept that to myself. We shook hands, exchanged contact information, and I walked back to the office feeling like I was living in someone else's life, like I'd somehow stumbled into a reality that was too good, too perfect, too aligned with everything I'd been working towards for years. The call came 2 days later. Amanda Chen contacted Richard Morrison directly, bypassing the team that had been working on the pitch, and delivered her ultimatum with the kind of calm certainty that comes from holding all the cards. She wanted Morrison and Associates for the contract, but only if I was the lead consultant, only if I had final authority on strategy and implementation, only if the partners stepped back and let me run the engagement my way. She was offering a contract worth $8 million over 2 years, with the potential for renewal and expansion if the relationship worked well, but it was contingent on me being in charge. I wasn't in the room when Richard Morrison delivered this news to the partners, but Maria told me about it later, described the scene with the kind of relish that suggested she'd enjoyed watching the realization dawn on their faces. David had apparently turned red, actually flushed with anger and disbelief, demanding to know how this had happened, how a junior associate had established a relationship with a client they'd been courting without anyone knowing about it. Sarah had gone quiet, that dangerous kind of quiet that precedes an explosion, her mind clearly racing to understand how she'd missed this, how someone she'd dismissed as irrelevant had managed to outmaneuver her so completely. Marcus had tried to argue that this was unacceptable, that they couldn't set a precedent of letting clients dictate internal staffing decisions, that it would undermine the firm's authority and hierarchy. But Richard Morrison, to his credit, had shut down that conversation quickly. "We're not turning down $8 million because your egos are bruised," he'd said, according to Maria. "This young woman has apparently built a relationship with a CEO we've been failing to connect with for months. Maybe instead of being angry about it, we should be asking ourselves what she's doing right that we're doing wrong." That was when they called me into the conference room, the same conference room where I'd sat countless times before, being mocked, being dismissed, being treated like a joke. But this time was different. This time I walked in knowing that the power dynamics had shifted, that they needed me more than I needed them, that all those years of quiet building were about to pay dividends beyond anything I'd imagined. They were all there. David, Sarah, Marcus, and Richard Morrison, sitting at the head of the table, looking at me with an expression that mixed respect with something that might have been pride. The others looked angry, confused, grudgingly impressed, struggling to reconcile the person they'd dismissed with the person who'd apparently just secured the biggest contract of the year. "Sit down," David said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. I sat, keeping my expression neutral, waiting to see how this would play out, knowing that this was a critical moment, that how I handled the next few minutes would determine not just this contract, but my entire future at the firm. "Amanda Chen wants you to lead the Meridian account," Sarah said, stating the obvious. Care to explain how that happened? I could have been modest, could have downplayed my role, could have tried to smooth things over and make it less threatening to their egos. But something in me rebelled against that impulse. Some part of me that was tired of making myself small, tired of pretending to be less than I was, tired of protecting their feelings at the expense of my own dignity and achievement. "I met with her," I said simply. "We talked about what Meridian actually needs rather than what we want to sell them. I proposed an approach that I believe will serve their interests and ours. She liked it. She trusted me. So she made it a condition of the contract that I lead the engagement." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with implications and realizations. I watched them process this information, watched them understand that I'd been operating on a completely different level than they'd realized, that I'd built relationships and demonstrated capabilities that they'd either missed or deliberately ignored. "You went behind our backs," Marcus said, his voice accusatory. "You undermined the team, pursued a client relationship without authorization, operated outside the chain of command." I met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated or made to feel guilty for my success. I built a relationship with a potential client using my own network and my own time. I didn't undermine anyone. I created an opportunity that didn't exist before. If I'd come to you with the idea of reaching out to Amanda Chen directly, would you have supported it? Would you have given me permission? Or would you have dismissed it the same way you dismissed my strategy memo? He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because we both knew what the truth was. "The question now," Richard Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension, "is whether we're going to let our internal politics cost us this contract. Amanda Chen has made her position clear. We can accept her terms and secure $8 million in business, or we can refuse and lose both the contract and our reputation with a company that's about to become very influential in our target market. I know which choice I prefer, but I want to hear from all of you." David looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to find some way to reassert control, to put me back in my place and restore the natural order as he understood it. But he was also a businessman, and he could do the math as well as anyone. $8 million was too much to sacrifice on the altar of his ego, no matter how bruised it was. "Fine," he said finally, the word coming out like he was spitting poison. "She can lead the account. But this is a trial. If she fails, if this blows up, it's on her, and we go back to standard operating procedure." "She won't fail," Richard Morrison said, and there was certainty in his voice that surprised me, touched me, reminded me that not everyone in this room had been against me, that I'd had allies even when I felt most alone. "She's been quietly succeeding at things none of you noticed for years. This is just the first time it's been impossible to ignore. And that's how it happened, how I went from being the office joke to leading the firm's most important account, not through gradual promotion or earned recognition, but through a sudden dramatic shift that left everyone scrambling to adjust to a new reality. But the real revelation, the moment that truly changed everything, was still to come, because the Meridian contract was just the beginning, just the first card to fall in a much larger restructuring of power that I'd been engineering without anyone realizing it. The first team meeting for the Meridian account was scheduled for the following Monday, and I spent the weekend preparing not just the substantive materials we'd need, but preparing myself emotionally for what I knew would be a difficult transition. David, Sarah, and Marcus would be on the team, not because I wanted them there, but because Richard Morrison insisted that senior partners needed to be involved in accounts of this magnitude, even if they weren't leading them. I understood the politics of it, understood that I was being set up to succeed or fail in the most public way possible, that my every move would be scrutinized, that any mistake would be magnified and used as evidence that I wasn't ready for this level of responsibility. I arrived early, set up the conference room, prepared materials, rehearsed my opening remarks. When they filed in, the atmosphere was glacial. David took a seat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, his body language screaming resistance and resentment. Sarah sat with her laptop open, making a show of being too busy with other things to give this meeting her full attention. Marcus wore an expression of barely concealed contempt, as if he were a professor forced to sit through a presentation by a student he considered hopelessly inadequate. I stood at the front of the room, looking at these people who'd made my professional life so difficult for so long, and I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not triumph, but a kind of calm clarity, an understanding that this moment had always been coming, that all the pieces had been falling into place for years, and now I was finally in position to show them what I'd built. "Thank you all for being here," I started, keeping my voice professional, warm but authoritative. "I know this is an unusual situation, and I appreciate your willingness to work with me on this account. I want to be clear about something from the start. This is a team effort. Yes, Amanda Chen requested that I lead the engagement, but I have no illusions that I can do this alone. I need your experience, your expertise, your insights. What I'm asking is that you trust me on strategy and direction, and in return, I promise to value your contributions and ensure that this account succeeds for all of us." It was a good opening, I thought, striking the right balance between asserting my authority and acknowledging their value, creating space for collaboration without conceding control. But David wasn't having it. "Let's cut through the corporate speak," he said, his voice sharp. "You somehow convinced Amanda Chen to trust you. Congratulations on that, but let's be honest about what this is. You got lucky, made a connection, said the right things to the right person. That doesn't mean you know how to actually run an account like this. So why don't you step back? Let those of us with actual experience handle the heavy lifting, and you can be the face of the account since that's apparently what the client wants." I took a breath, counted to 3, reminded myself that I'd prepared for this, that I knew this was coming. "David, I understand your concerns, and I appreciate you voicing them directly rather than behind my back. But here's the thing. Amanda Chen didn't choose me because I got lucky or because I'm good at making connections. She chose me because I understand her business, because I proposed a fundamentally different approach to consulting that aligns with what Meridian actually needs, and because she trusts that I can deliver results that traditional approaches haven't delivered. If you don't believe me, if you think this is just luck, then you're welcome to sit this account out. I'll find other partners to work with, people who are willing to try something new rather than defaulting to methods that are increasingly outdated in a changing market." The room went very quiet. I'd just told a senior partner, in front of other senior partners, that he was dispensable, that I didn't need him, that I had options and leverage that he apparently didn't realize I possessed. It was a risk, a massive risk, because I was betting that they needed this account more than they needed to put me in my place, that business interests would trump personal vendettas. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and I saw her reassessing me in real time, understanding perhaps for the first time that I wasn't playing the game she thought I was playing. Marcus's expression shifted from contempt to something more cautious, more calculating, as if he were suddenly realizing that the power dynamics had changed more fundamentally than he'd understood. David looked like he'd been slapped, his face flushing with anger and something that might have been embarrassment. "You can't talk to me like that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, lacked the absolute certainty that usually characterized his pronouncements. "I just did," I replied, keeping my tone even. "And I'll keep doing it if you continue to undermine this engagement before it's even started. You have a choice, David. You can work with me, contribute your genuine best work, and share in the success of this account. Or you can fight me every step of the way, make this difficult, and watch while I replace you with partners who are more interested in moving forward than defending their egos. Richard Morrison gave me authority over this account, and I intend to use it. So what's it going to be?" I was pushing hard, gambling that they wouldn't call my bluff, gambling that the contract was too valuable, that my sudden display of authority would shock them into compliance rather than rebellion. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable, became almost unbearable. And then Richard Morrison walked into the conference room, unexpected, unannounced, and I realized that he'd probably been outside the whole time, listening, waiting to see how I'd handle the confrontation. "I think," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of authority, "that David and the rest of you need to understand something fundamental about what's happening here. This isn't about egos or hierarchy or who's been at the firm the longest. This is about results, about evolution, about adapting to a market that's changing faster than our traditional approaches can accommodate. I've been watching this young woman for years, watching her build relationships, develop insights, create value in ways that most of you have been too busy or too arrogant to notice. Amanda Chen's request wasn't a fluke. It was the inevitable result of competence meeting opportunity. So you can either get on board with this new reality, or you can explain to our other partners why we lost an $8 million contract because you couldn't handle taking direction from someone younger and less credentialed than you. Your choice." It was a mic drop moment, the kind of unequivocal support that I'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Richard Morrison had just staked his own reputation on me, had just told the senior partners in the clearest possible terms that I had his backing, that resisting me meant resisting him. David understood. I could see it in his eyes, the calculation, the recognition that he'd lost this particular battle, and that continuing to fight would only damage his own position. "Fine," he said, and though the word was grudging, it was also a capitulation. "I'll work with you. But I still think this is a mistake, and when it fails, I'll be the first to say I told you so. When it succeeds," I corrected, "I hope you'll be the first to acknowledge that maybe there are ways of doing business that you haven't considered, that innovation sometimes comes from unexpected sources, that underestimating people based on their position or background is a mistake you can't afford to keep making." The meeting proceeded from there, still tense but productive, and I laid out my strategy for the Meridian account, explaining the philosophy behind it, the specific deliverables, the timeline, the metrics we'd use to measure success. I assigned roles, delegated responsibilities, made it clear that while I valued input, final decisions would come through me. And slowly, reluctantly, they began to engage, began to see that maybe, just maybe, I knew what I was doing. But the real revelation, the moment that truly crystallized everything, came 2 weeks later at a firm-wide partners meeting. Richard Morrison stood at the front of the room, looking at the assembled partners, and he made an announcement that nobody saw coming. "I want to talk about succession planning," he said, and the room immediately went alert because succession at a firm like Morrison & Associates wasn't just about promotions, it was about power, about equity, about who would shape the firm's future. I'm not getting any younger, and neither are several of our founding partners. We need to start thinking seriously about who will lead this firm in the next decade, who has the vision and capability to navigate markets and client relationships that look nothing like they did when we started this business. He paused, letting the tension build, and I sat in the back of the room, not at the partners' table because I wasn't a partner, just in a chair against the wall, taking notes, assuming this conversation had nothing to do with me. "I'm proposing," Richard continued, "that we create a new position, Chief Strategy Officer, someone who will work directly with me and the senior partners to shape our long-term direction, identify new opportunities, manage our most critical client relationships. This isn't a ceremonial role, it's a real position with real authority, and I already know who I want for it." He looked directly at me, and my heart stopped. "I'm proposing that we offer this position to our junior associate who just secured the Meridian contract, who has been quietly revolutionizing how we do business for years, who has demonstrated strategic thinking and relationship-building capabilities that exceed those of people twice her age with twice her experience. I'm proposing that we promote her to Chief Strategy Officer, make her a junior partner, and give her the authority and resources to reshape how this firm operates." The room erupted, not with applause but with shock, with protests, with disbelief. David was on his feet immediately, arguing that this was unprecedented, that it violated every norm of how partnerships worked, that you couldn't just skip someone over multiple levels of seniority based on one successful account. Other partners joined in, some agreeing with David, others looking thoughtful, a few looking intrigued by the boldness of the proposal. And I sat there, stunned, overwhelmed, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me, like I'd suddenly been catapulted into a reality I'd dreamed about, but never truly expected. Richard let them argue for a few minutes, then held up his hand for silence. I understand the concerns, and under normal circumstances, I'd agree that this kind of leap is inappropriate. But these aren't normal circumstances. Our industry is changing, our client expectations are evolving, and we need leadership that understands these changes intuitively rather than intellectually. I'm not asking you to make her managing partner, I'm asking you to recognize exceptional talent and give it room to grow. And I'm reminding you that she's already doing work at this level, she's just been doing it without the title or the recognition or the compensation. All I'm proposing is that we acknowledge reality and structure our firm accordingly. The vote was close, closer than I would have expected, but it passed. Not unanimously, not with enthusiasm from everyone, but it passed. And just like that, I became Chief Strategy Officer of Morrison & Associates, the youngest person to ever hold a leadership position at the firm, the first woman to break into the senior ranks in the company's 30-year history. The weeks that followed were surreal, like living in a dream that I kept expecting to end. I moved into a real office, one with windows, one that announced my new status to everyone who walked past. I attended partner meetings, had input into firm-wide decisions, hired my own team of analysts and associates who would work directly for me. The Meridian account progressed beautifully. Amanda Chen was thrilled with our approach, with the results we were delivering, with the partnership we were building. She started referring other CEOs to us, started talking about Morrison & Associates as a firm that was different, that actually understood modern business rather than just recycling old consulting playbooks. Our reputation grew, our client roster expanded, our revenue increased. And through it all, I maintained relationships with the people who'd helped me get there. The assistants, the IT staff, the junior associates who'd supported me when I was one of them. I made sure Maria got a raise and a promotion, made sure James got recognition for his work, made sure that the invisible people who kept the firm running weren't invisible anymore. I created mentorship programs, brought in diverse hiring initiatives, started reshaping the firm's culture from the inside out. But I never forgot the mockery. Never forgot the years of being dismissed and diminished and treated like a joke. Not because I was bitter, but because I wanted to remember, wanted to stay connected to what it felt like to be underestimated, so that I'd never do the same thing to someone else, so that I'd always look for the quiet builders, the patient strategists, the people who were accumulating power beneath the surface, while everyone else was performing importance on the stage above. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for, not consciously, not as something I'd planned, but as an inevitable culmination of everything that had been building for years. It was at the firm's annual gala, the big black tie event where we celebrated our successes, announced promotions, schmoozed with clients, and tried to project an image of sophistication and success. I was there in a dress that actually fit the occasion, no longer playing the part of the underdressed junior associate, now looking like someone who belonged in these rooms, in these conversations, in these circles of power. David approached me at the bar, drink in hand, his face flushed with alcohol and something that might have been grudging respect. "I underestimated you," he said without preamble, and I could tell the admission cost him something, could see that his pride was warring with his business sense, that he was trying to rebuild a bridge he'd spent years burning. "Yes, you did," I agreed, seeing no point in false modesty or in making this easier for him than it needed to be. "You all did, for years. You made me the joke, made me feel small, made me question my own worth and capabilities. You took credit for my work, dismissed my ideas, treated me like I was decorative but not functional." He flinched slightly and I continued, "But here's what you didn't realize, what none of you realized. Every time you underestimated me, you gave me freedom. Every time you dismissed my ideas, you gave me permission to implement them quietly, without your interference. Every time you treated me like I didn't matter, you allowed me to build relationships and accumulate power without anyone watching closely enough to stop me. Your mockery was my camouflage, your contempt was my opportunity. So in a strange way, I should probably thank you, because your inability to see me clearly is a big part of why I'm standing here now as Chief Strategy Officer, while you're trying to figure out how to stay relevant in a firm that's evolving past the approach you represent." He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between admiration and fear, a recognition that he was talking to someone who'd outplayed him so thoroughly that he was only now beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. "What do you want?" he asked, and I appreciated the directness, the acknowledgement that power dynamics had shifted, and that he was now in a position of asking rather than telling. "I want you to do your job well," I said simply. "I want you to contribute to this firm's success without trying to undermine people who threaten your ego. I want you to recognize that talent and insight can come from anywhere, not just from people who look like you or have backgrounds like yours. And honestly, David, I want you to be better. Because you're actually good at parts of this work, you're just so wrapped up in maintaining status and hierarchy that you miss opportunities to actually excel at what you do. He nodded slowly, processing this, and I could see him making calculations, trying to figure out how to position himself in this new reality, where I held cards he didn't even know existed. The clients, he said, the ones you've been cultivating, the relationships you've built, they all know you, trust you. If you left, they'd follow you, wouldn't they? It wasn't really a question, more an acknowledgement of the leverage I held, the power I'd accumulated through years of quiet relationship building. Yes, I said, because there was no point in denying what we both knew was true. Jonathan Reeves, Amanda Chen, at least a dozen other major clients, they'd follow me if I started my own firm or went to a competitor. But I'm not planning to leave, David. I'm planning to build something here, to reshape this firm into something that's actually worthy of the talent we employ and the clients we serve. You can be part of that, or you can keep fighting it, but the outcome isn't in question anymore. The question is just whether you're smart enough to recognize it. Sarah found me later in the evening, pulled me aside into a quiet corner, her expression serious. I need to apologize, she said, and unlike David's admission, this one seemed to come from a place of genuine remorse rather than strategic calculation. I was cruel to you, and I knew I was being cruel, and I did it anyway because I was threatened, because you reminded me of what I'd given up, the parts of myself I'd suppressed to fit into this world. You were authentic and patient and strategic in ways I'd forgotten how to be. And instead of learning from that, I tried to diminish you, tried to make you as small as I felt inside. I hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for genuine vulnerability from someone who'd been so consistently hostile. Why are you telling me this? I asked, not unkindly, just curious about her motivations, about whether this was another strategic move or something more real. Because I want to be better, she said, and I heard an echo of what I'd said to David, a recognition that maybe the old ways of operating weren't serving anyone well. Because I'm tired of being the person who tears other women down, who plays the game by rules that were designed to keep us fighting each other instead of fighting the actual problems. Because I think you're building something important here, and I want to be part of it, if you'll let me. Have you ever had someone who hurt you deeply come back and genuinely apologize, genuinely try to make amends? It's a strange feeling, disorienting, because it challenges your narrative about who they are, forces you to hold both their cruelty and their humanity in your mind at the same time. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and I saw not just the polished partner who'd mocked me, but a woman who'd been navigating the same hostile environment I had, who'd made different choices, survival choices that had cost her pieces of herself. Okay, I said. Let's figure out what better looks like together. But I need you to understand something. I'm not interested in performative allyship or strategic friendship. If you're going to work with me, I need authenticity. I need you to show up as your full self, not as the person you think you need to be to succeed in a male-dominated industry. Can you do that? She nodded, and I saw tears in her eyes, genuine emotion breaking through the professional facade she'd maintained for so long. I can try, she said. I want to try. Marcus was the last to come around, the most resistant to the new order, the most invested in maintaining the old hierarchies. He never apologized, never acknowledged his role in making my professional life difficult, but he did something perhaps more meaningful. He started actually listening to me in meetings, started implementing my suggestions without trying to claim credit, started deferring to my judgment on strategic decisions. It wasn't friendship, wasn't even really respect, but it was accommodation, an acceptance that the world had changed and that fighting it was costing him more than adapting to it would. The firm evolved rapidly under my leadership, not because I had all the answers, but because I was willing to ask different questions, to challenge assumptions, to empower people who'd been overlooked or underutilized. We brought in younger partners, more diverse voices, people who understood that consulting in the modern era required humility and genuine partnership rather than expertise performed from a position of superiority. Our client relationships deepened, our reputation for innovation grew, our revenue increased year over year. Richard Morrison retired 2 years later, and in his farewell speech at the partners meeting, he said something that I'll never forget. When I started this firm 30 years ago, I thought I understood what made great consultants, credentials, experience, confidence, all the traditional markers of expertise. But watching this young woman build something extraordinary right under our noses taught me that I'd been looking at the wrong things, that the real markers of exceptional talent are patience, strategic thinking, genuine relationship building, and the courage to be underestimated while you accumulate power. She didn't demand recognition. She earned it so thoroughly that recognition became inevitable. She didn't fight the system. She built a parallel system that eventually became more real than the official hierarchy. She's not just the future of this firm. She's the model for how leadership works in a world that's evolving faster than our old assumptions can accommodate. I stood there listening to him, feeling the weight of what he was saying, feeling the responsibility of the platform I'd built, the power I'd accumulated, the influence I now held. And I thought about all those years of being the joke, of sitting in conference rooms while they mocked me, of smiling while they diminished me, of building in silence while they performed their importance. I thought about that moment when I made the decision to let them underestimate me, to use their contempt as camouflage, to be patient when everything in me wanted to fight back immediately. And I realized that the mockery had been a gift. Strange as that sounds, because it had taught me something fundamental about power, that the most sustainable kind doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, doesn't need external validation, because it's built on foundations so deep and so strong that they can't be shaken by opinion or perception. The people who mocked me thought they were keeping me in my place, but what they were actually doing was giving me space to grow in directions they couldn't see, couldn't anticipate, couldn't control. Every laugh at my expense was permission to build without scrutiny. Every dismissive comment was freedom to operate beneath their radar. Every moment of underestimation was an opportunity to accumulate leverage they didn't know existed. And when the revelation finally came, when they finally saw what I'd built, it wasn't because I'd suddenly become someone different. It was because they'd finally stopped being blinded by their own assumptions and saw what had been there all along. I control their careers now, not through explicit authority over hiring and firing, though as Chief Strategy Officer I have that too, but through something more fundamental, through relationships with clients they depend on, through strategic insights they've learned they can't replicate, through a vision for the firm's future that they've come to understand is more sophisticated and more sustainable than anything they'd developed on their own. Jonathan Reeves won't work with anyone else at the firm. Amanda Chen has made it clear that our relationship with Meridian is contingent on my continued involvement. A dozen other major clients have similar loyalties. If I left, I'd take a third of the firm's revenue with me, maybe more. But more than that, I've reshaped how the firm operates, who gets hired, how we develop talent, how we approach client relationships, what we value and prioritize. The firm that exists now is fundamentally different from the one I joined all those years ago, not because I staged a revolution, but because I slowly, methodically, patiently built something better alongside the existing structure until the better version became impossible to ignore and eventually became the default. David still works at the firm. He's actually become a decent colleague, not a friend, never a friend, but someone who contributes value without trying to undermine people who threaten him. Sarah and I have built a genuine partnership. She leads our diversity and inclusion initiatives with the kind of authentic passion that can only come from someone who's done the internal work to understand their own complicity in harmful systems. Marcus left the firm last year, not because I pushed him out, but because he couldn't adapt, couldn't let go of the old ways, couldn't stomach taking direction from someone he'd spent years dismissing. He's at another firm now, doing the same work in the same ways, and from what I hear, he's increasingly frustrated as clients ask for approaches that look more like what we're doing at Morrison & Associates, approaches that he still doesn't fully understand or value. The story I've been telling you, this journey from being the office joke to controlling the careers of the people who mocked me, isn't really about revenge or vindication, though I won't lie and say those feelings weren't part of the experience. It's about something deeper, something more fundamental about how power actually works in professional environments, in organizations, in any system where success is determined not just by individual brilliance, but by complex webs of relationships, dependencies, and accumulated influence over time. What I learned, what I want you to understand if you take anything from my story, is that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you let it define you, if you internalize the dismissal and start believing that maybe they're right, maybe you aren't capable or valuable or worthy of respect. But if you can hold on to your own sense of worth, if you can maintain your vision of what you're building even when nobody else can see it, then underestimation becomes one of the most powerful advantages you can have. It gives you freedom to operate without scrutiny, to build without interference, to accumulate power in forms that people aren't watching for because they're so convinced you're not a threat. I think about the younger version of myself sometimes. The woman who walked into Morrison and Associates with her cheap suit and her borrowed confidence, who accepted that windowless office and that dismissive treatment because she thought it was the price of admission, who believed that if she just worked hard enough and waited long enough, recognition would eventually come. I want to go back and tell her that she was both right and wrong. Right that patience and strategic thinking would pay off, but wrong to think that recognition would ever be given rather than taken. I want to tell her that the mockery was coming, that it would hurt, that there would be days when she'd want to quit, when she'd question whether any of this was worth it. But I also want to tell her that she was stronger than she knew, more strategic than anyone realized, capable of building something so substantial that it would eventually become impossible to ignore or diminish. I want to tell her that the people laughing at her were actually terrified of her, even if they didn't know it yet, terrified of what she represented, of the changes she would bring, of the ways she would expose the inadequacy of their traditional approaches and old boy networks. I think about all the other people out there right now who are being underestimated, who are sitting in meetings where they're dismissed or ignored, who are doing exceptional work that nobody acknowledges, who are building something beneath the surface while everyone else is busy performing their importance above it. I want you to know that you're not alone, that what you're experiencing isn't unique, that the mockery and dismissal say more about the people doing it than about you. I want you to understand that if you're patient, if you're strategic, if you keep building even when nobody's watching or caring or acknowledging your efforts, you're accumulating something that can't be taken away, can't be diminished by opinion or perception, can't be denied when it finally becomes too large to ignore. But I also want to be honest with you about the costs, because this path isn't easy, isn't simple, isn't without real emotional and psychological toll. There were nights when I cried myself to sleep, days when I felt so isolated and alone that I questioned whether I was crazy, whether I was seeing patterns that didn't exist, building toward a future that would never come. There were moments when the mockery cut so deep that I almost believed it, almost started thinking that maybe they were right. Maybe I was delusional to think I could build something meaningful in an environment so hostile to my success. The journey required sacrifices, relationships that withered because I didn't have energy left over for maintaining them, personal interests that fell away because every spare moment was invested in building professional capital, parts of myself that I had to suppress or hide because showing my full personality would have made me too vulnerable to the people looking for weaknesses to exploit. I'm not going to romanticize this or pretend it was some kind of triumphant journey without darkness or difficulty. It was hard, brutally hard sometimes, and there were costs that I'm still accounting for, still trying to understand. But here's what I know with absolute certainty. It was worth it. Not just because I ended up with a title and authority and financial security, though those things matter and I'm not going to pretend they don't. It was worth it because I proved something to myself, proved that I could build power on my own terms, that I could navigate hostile systems without compromising my core values, that I could be both strategic and authentic, both patient and ambitious, both accommodating on the surface and absolutely unwavering in my commitment to building something better beneath it. I proved that underestimation is only permanent if you accept it, that mockery only has power if you internalize it, that being dismissed and diminished can actually be the first step toward building something so substantial that dismissal becomes impossible. And maybe most importantly, I proved that you don't have to become like the people who hurt you in order to succeed, that you can build power without becoming cruel, that you can accumulate influence without abandoning empathy, that you can reshape systems from the inside without losing yourself in the process. The firm I've built, or rather helped rebuild, is fundamentally different from the one that existed when I started, not just in its practices and policies, but in its culture, in what it values, in how it treats people, in what it considers important. We hire differently now, looking for potential and strategic thinking rather than just credentials and connections. We promote differently, recognizing people who build relationships and deliver results rather than just those who perform expertise convincingly. We develop talent differently, creating space for people to grow at their own pace rather than forcing everyone through the same rigid progression of titles and responsibilities. And we treat people differently, with dignity and respect and genuine appreciation for the full range of contributions that make an organization successful. Not just the visible, easily credited work, but the invisible labor of relationship building, problem solving, culture shaping that makes everything else possible. This cultural transformation didn't happen overnight, didn't happen because I gave a speech or wrote a memo or made a declaration. It happened slowly, through hundreds of small decisions, through hiring choices and promotion decisions, through which behaviors I rewarded and which I discouraged, through the example I set in how I treated people and what I prioritized. It happened because I had the power to make those decisions, the authority to reshape systems, the leverage to insist on better even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable for people who benefited from the old ways. And I had that power not because it was given to me, but because I built it, methodically, patiently, strategically, over years of quiet accumulation, while everyone else was busy looking the other way. So when you ask me how it feels to control the careers of the people who made me the joke, who spent years treating me like I was decorative but not functional, who mocked my wardrobe and my background and my ideas, I'll tell you this. It feels like justice, not the vengeful kind, but the restorative kind, the kind that corrects imbalances and creates space for better ways of operating. It feels like vindication, not because I need their approval or acknowledgement, but because the evidence is now undeniable that they were wrong about me, catastrophically wrong, and that their wrongness cost them opportunities and influence they'll never get back. But mostly, it feels like responsibility, like I've been given a platform and authority that I need to use wisely, that I need to leverage not just for my own success, but to make things better for everyone who comes after me, everyone who might otherwise face the same dismissal and mockery and underestimation that I faced. I think about the next generation of young professionals who will walk through Morrison & Associates doors, who will start in junior positions, who will have ambitions that seem too large for their current circumstances. I want them to find something different from what I found, not an environment free from challenge or competition or difficulty, because those things are inevitable and probably necessary for growth, but an environment where their potential is recognized, where their contributions are valued, where being different or unconventional or from an unexpected background is seen as an asset rather than a liability. I want them to never have to smile through mockery the way I did, never have to pretend to be less than they are in order to avoid threatening fragile egos, never have to build power in the shadows because building it openly would invite too much resistance. I want to create an environment where brilliance is recognized and developed regardless of what package it comes in, where strategic thinking is valued whether it comes from a first-year associate or a senior partner, where innovation is encouraged even when it challenges established ways of operating. And I'm using my power, the power I accumulated through years of invisible building, to make that vision real, to reshape the firm's culture and practices in ways that make it not just more successful, but more humane, more equitable, more worthy of the talented people who choose to build their careers here. This is what I mean when I say I control their careers now, not just David and Sarah and Marcus, though their continued success at the firm is absolutely dependent on their willingness to align with the new culture I'm building. But everyone at the firm, everyone who wants to succeed here now, has to adapt to a different set of values, a different definition of what excellence looks like, a different understanding of how power and influence actually work. The old model, where credentials and connections and confident performance were enough to guarantee success, where you could coast on privilege and maintain position through relationships established before you even started your career, that model is obsolete at Morrison & Associates. Not because I declared it obsolete, but because I built something better, something more sustainable, something more aligned with how business actually works in our current environment. And here's the beautiful irony that I appreciate more every day. The people who mocked me, who tried to keep me small, who invested their energy in maintaining hierarchies that benefited them, they're the ones who enabled this transformation. Because if they'd recognized my capabilities early on, if they'd brought me into their inner circle and given me traditional pathways to advancement, I would have had less incentive to build something different, less motivation to challenge fundamental assumptions about how the firm operated, less drive to accumulate the particular kind of power that comes from building parallel structures rather than climbing existing ladders. Their hostility pushed me to innovate in ways that their support never would have. Their dismissal created the conditions for me to develop approaches and relationships that were fundamentally more valuable than anything their old boy network could produce. So in a very real sense, they created their own obsolescence, made themselves less relevant, less powerful, less central to the firm's success by pushing me to build something that would eventually replace or subsume their traditional power bases. I sometimes wonder if they understand this, if they've done the math and realized that every joke at my expense, every dismissive comment, every attempt to diminish me was actually an investment in my eventual success and their relative decline. I don't think they have. Honestly, I think most of them still see what happened as random or lucky, rather than as the inevitable result of their own actions, creating pressure that I channeled into productive building. They still don't fully understand that power isn't what they thought it was, that titles and positions and formal authority are just shadows of real power, which comes from relationships, from dependencies, from being genuinely valuable in ways that can't be easily replaced or replicated. So let me bring this full circle. Back to that conference room where I sat smiling while they mocked me. Back to that moment when I decided to let them underestimate me, to use their contempt as camouflage for the building I was doing beneath the surface. That moment wasn't the beginning of my story. It was the culmination of years of preparation, of strategic positioning, of patient accumulation of power that nobody saw coming because they were too busy looking at the wrong things. And when I smiled, when I let their jokes land without defense or protest, I wasn't being passive or accepting defeat. I was exercising the most sophisticated form of power there is, the power to know something they didn't, to see the future they couldn't imagine, to be absolutely certain of an outcome that they thought was impossible. That smile contained years of quiet victories, of relationships built and nurtured, of information gathered and analyzed, of moves made so subtly that they registered as luck or coincidence rather than strategy. That smile said, without words, without explicit threat, "You think you're winning, but you're actually creating the conditions for my success. And by the time you understand what's happening, it will be too late to stop it." And I was right. It was too late. The transformation was already underway, the power already accumulated, the dependencies already established, the future already written in invisible ink that would only become visible when circumstances aligned to reveal what had been there all along. Now, as I stand here years later, as Chief Strategy Officer of a firm I've fundamentally reshaped, as someone whose decisions affect hundreds of careers and millions of dollars in business, as someone who holds genuine power rather than just performing it, I can tell you that the journey was worth it, that the mockery and the struggle and the long years of being underestimated all contributed to building something more substantial than what I could have created through traditional paths. But I can also tell you this: I never want to forget what it felt like to be dismissed, to be made small, to have my contributions ignored and my potential denied. I never want to become the kind of leader who looks at young people with ambition and sees threats rather than assets, who uses power to diminish rather than to develop, who values performance over substance and credentials over capability. I want to remain connected to that version of myself who smiled through mockery, who built in silence, who was patient when everything in her wanted to fight immediately, because that version of myself understands something fundamental that's easy to forget once you have power, that the most valuable people in any organization are often the ones being overlooked, that potential often comes in unexpected packages, that underestimation creates opportunities for those brave enough and patient enough to exploit it. So here's what I want you to take from my story. If you're being underestimated right now, if people are making you the joke, if you're sitting in meetings where your contributions are ignored and your potential is denied, know that this can be temporary. Know that you have more power than you realize. Know that patient building can eventually overcome even the most entrenched resistance. But also know that the path is hard, that it requires sacrifice and strategy and a willingness to delay gratification in ways that can feel almost unbearable sometimes. Know that you'll need to make choices about what you're willing to compromise and what you'll protect at all costs, about which battles to fight openly and which to win through indirect means, about when to push back and when to smile and build in silence. Most importantly, know that building real power, sustainable power, the kind that can't be taken away or diminished by opinion or circumstance, requires thinking in longer timeframes than most people are comfortable with, requires patience that goes against every instinct screaming for immediate recognition and justice, requires a kind of faith in your own vision and capability that can be incredibly difficult to maintain when everyone around you is telling you that you're wrong, that you're not good enough, that you should accept your place and stop reaching for things beyond your station. But if you can do it, if you can hold on to yourself while accumulating power, if you can remain authentic while being strategic, if you can build something substantial while everyone else is distracted by surface-level performances, then eventually you'll find yourself in a position where the people who mocked you need you more than you need them, where your vision shapes their possibilities, where what you built in silence becomes impossible to ignore. And when that moment comes, when the revelation finally happens, when they finally see what you've built and understand what they missed, you'll have a choice about what kind of leader you want to be, whether you want to use your power for revenge or for reconstruction, whether you want to perpetuate the systems that hurt you or build something better. I chose reconstruction, chose to use my power to reshape the firm into something more equitable and more humane, chose to create the environment I wish I'd found when I started rather than simply becoming a more successful version of the people who dismissed me. That choice, more than the accumulation of power itself, is what I'm most proud of. What I hope defines my legacy when I'm eventually the one making way for the next generation of leaders. Because here's the ultimate truth I've learned through this journey. Power is just a tool, neutral in itself, made meaningful only by how you choose to use it, by what you build with it, by whose lives you improve or diminish through your decisions. The people who mocked me had power too, had positions and authority and influence, but they used it to maintain hierarchies, to protect their status, to keep people like me in our place. And in doing so, they made themselves obsolete, made their kind of power less relevant, less valuable, less sustainable than the kind I was building. I took that same raw material, that same opportunity to exercise influence over people's careers and lives, and I'm trying to use it differently, to open doors rather than close them, to recognize potential rather than demand credentials, to build systems that develop talent rather than just exploit it. I don't know if I'm succeeding at that. Honestly, it's probably too early to tell, too close to judge objectively. But I know I'm trying, know I'm making different choices than the people who came before me, know I'm using the platform they inadvertently helped me build to create something that's at least attempting to be better, more just, more aligned with the values I hold about human dignity and potential. So to everyone out there who's been made the joke, who's sitting in their own version of that conference room where I smiled while being mocked, who's wondering if the struggle is worth it, if the patient building will ever pay off, if the underestimation will ever transform into recognition, I want to leave you with this. Yes, it's worth it. Yes, the patient building pays off. Yes, underestimation can become your greatest advantage if you're strategic enough and patient enough to exploit it. But also remember that accumulating power isn't the end goal, it's just a means to an end, a tool for building something better, a platform for making changes that benefit not just you, but everyone who comes after you. Don't just seek revenge on the people who dismissed you, though I won't judge you if some part of you wants that. I certainly felt it. Instead, use whatever power you accumulate to build systems where fewer people face the same dismissal, where potential is recognized more readily, where being different or unexpected becomes an asset rather than a liability. That's how you truly win, not by becoming more successful than the people who mocked you, though that's satisfying too, but by making their kind of thinking obsolete, by building something so much better than what they created that future generations look back and wonder how anyone ever thought those old hierarchies and assumptions made sense. That's the real victory, the one that lasts beyond your own career, beyond your own satisfaction, beyond even the people who wronged you and the specific circumstances of your struggle. That's the legacy I'm trying to build at Morrison & Associates. And that's the challenge I'm offering to you. Not just to accumulate power through patient building, but to use that power to make things genuinely better, to create the environments you wish had existed when you were starting out, to be the leader you needed when you were sitting in that conference room, smiling while being mocked, building in silence while everyone else was performing their importance. If you've made it this far in my story, if you've sat with me through this entire journey from dismissed junior associate to chief strategy officer, from office joke to controlling careers, from being underestimated to being undeniable, then you understand what I'm trying to say. You understand that this isn't just my story, but a blueprint, a methodology, a demonstration of what's possible when you refuse to let other people's limitations define your potential. Now I want to hear from you. Have you experienced something similar in your own career or life? Have you been underestimated, dismissed, made to feel small by people who couldn't or wouldn't see your true capabilities? How did you respond? Did you fight back immediately? Or did you take the patient approach of building power beneath the surface? What worked? What didn't? What would you do differently if you could go back and start over? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's build a community of people who understand that underestimation is temporary, that patience can be powerful, that quiet building often beats loud performance in the long run. And if this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your own experience or gave you hope for your own journey, please leave a like to show your support. It helps get these stories to more people who might need to hear them, who might be sitting in their own conference rooms right now, wondering if they should keep building or give up, wondering if the struggle is worth it. Hit that subscribe button for my truth-revealed tales if you want more stories like this, more honest explorations of professional journeys, personal transformations, and the complex dynamics of power and success in modern workplaces. We're building something here, a collection of authentic voices sharing real experiences, not filtered through corporate speak or sanitized for motivational purposes, but honest, complex, sometimes difficult truths about what it actually takes to succeed when the system isn't designed for your success. And make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss when we post new stories, because we're bringing you content regularly, stories that matter, experiences that resonate, truths that need to be told even when they're uncomfortable or challenging. Remember, the most powerful moves are the ones nobody sees coming. The quiet accumulations of influence that happen beneath the surface, while everyone else is busy performing their importance on the stage above. So be patient, be strategic, be willing to smile through mockery while you build something they can't even imagine. And when the moment comes, when what you've built becomes too large to ignore, use that power wisely. Use it to build something better. Use it to make sure fewer people have to take the path you took, have to smile through the same mockery, have to build in the same silence. That's how you truly win, not by defeating the people who underestimated you, but by making their way of thinking obsolete, by creating systems where potential is recognized regardless of packaging, where innovation is valued regardless of source, where power serves to develop rather than just to control. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to my truth. And I hope my story gives you strength for whatever building you're doing in your own life, whatever silent accumulation of power you're engaged in while others are too busy looking the wrong way to notice what you're creating. Keep building, keep being patient, keep believing in your own vision even when nobody else can see it, and know that eventually, inevitably, what you've built will become too substantial to ignore or diminish. And when that moment comes, when they finally see what you've created, smile that same knowing smile I smiled in that conference room. The smile that says without words, "I told you so. I just did it so quietly that you didn't hear me until it was too late to stop me."